You're now live.
Okay, and as soon as I take down the notice, I've got it. We're live, and this is Senate Finance. And this is the 17th of February. I guess our stars all aligned today, committee, because we were trying to start at 1:30 with Professor Colby, but this morning she notified us that she couldn't come, and we didn't get off the floor until 2 o'clock anyway. So we're here. We will try and reschedule her for next week. But next week is our pretty close to our final week. So we have got to start wrapping up some bills. The two big ones being the corporate income tax and the weighting study. So it is time to fish or cut bait here. So today we are going to take up S247, an act relating to prohibiting discrimination based on genetic information. I had Faith forward you an email I got from Kevin Gaffney at DFR, and it has the British system, which says if you take out, he thought it in pounds, it was like $1 million, but if you've got a very high value life insurance, you might allow companies a little more flexibility. So I sent that along for your information. And our first witness today is Deborah Vandemeel. Did I massacre your name?
It's Van Domelen, and I
Van Domelen, all right.
I apologize. The insurance industry keeps giving you horrible names to pronounce.
That's really very phonetic. Okay, so thank you. And you just tell us, introduce yourself for the record, tell us who you represent, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. I appreciate the opportunity this afternoon, Madam Chair. I am Dr. Deborah Van Domelen. I work for Northwestern Mutual, but I'm here today representing the ACLI. The ACLI is an organization of life insurers, but there are member companies like Northwestern Mutual who offer a full suite of products. Those can include life insurance, disability insurance, and long-term care insurance. So thank you, Madam Chair and the committee, for inviting me to offer some testimony on how all of these products could be negatively affected by Senate Bill 247. I would like to reiterate that insurance only works if the insurers have properly priced for an individual risk based on what is known by the applicant at the time of underwriting. So stated another way, we need to know what the applicant knows to prevent adverse selection. And in fact, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics recently noted that while legislative efforts like this may be rooted in good intentions, preventing this symmetric flow of relevant health information, quote, may adversely alter insurance underwriting in a way that has unanticipated consequences for both the industry and the individuals who are or wish to be insured, end quote. This would be the most restrictive bill, not only in the United States, but potentially the world. Even proponents of restrictions understand that family history is foundational to risk selection and proper pricing. But as introduced, this version of SB 247 threatens that. Without proper pricing, long-term solvency is put at risk. Know that we take the concerns expressed by the University of Vermont Medical Center seriously. The ACLI has addressed similar concerns from clinicians and researchers in other states like Louisiana. For that reason, we would suggest at least looking at the Louisiana approach as an alternative. It prevents insurers from basing coverage on applicant or family member participation in research, unless the genetic test results are in the medical record and predict future mortality and morbidity. Please also know that the insurance industry has done proactive outreach with the National Society of Genetic Counselors to educate them on how to help their patients access coverage. The simplest option is to purchase coverage before getting a genetic test. Nothing prevents individuals from first applying and getting underwritten for our products, and second, getting a genetic test afterwards. In this case, no genetic test would be part of the underwriting process, a process that we conduct once. For those who have already undergone testing, guaranteed issue is an option for life insurance. But you've asked me to specifically speak to disability and long-term care. And in fact, there are many similarities between individual life, disability, and long-term care insurance. First of all, purchasing is voluntary and personal, a decision that's part of financial planning. Underwriting occurs once and lasts for the duration of the policy, which is typically decades. Again, medical and genetic testing that is done later cannot be used to increase individual premiums or take away coverage. So group disability is actually provided by the majority of employers without underwriting. Individual disability coverage is voluntary and meant to supplement what employers offer. Long-term care, on the other hand, is not offered by many employers. So access to coverage is dependent on each state supporting the health of the individual long-term care market. There are those who have told us to price for it. That approach is much more problematic for long-term care, given the pricing challenges that already exist. Further increases put the viability of the entire product at risk. By expanding coverage to a few, existing policy owners could be priced out of the market because LTC is unique. While rates cannot be increased on an individual basis, it may be necessary to do so for the entire pool to address unfavorable claims experience. So price increases could be necessitated by adverse selection. And that would be detrimental to meeting the insurance coverage needs because it could limit and potentially cut off consumer choice. So let me give you an example. Dementia is a common reason for an extended long-term care claim. There are multiple known inherited factors, risk factors for early cognitive decline. Given the smaller population size of Vermont and even smaller number of long-term care policyholders there, insurance tourism could force insurers to shut down the long-term care market to protect the existing policyholders. Be also aware that the negative effects of adverse selection will show up sooner in the disability insurance and long-term care markets, since the inability to work or perform personal care will occur years before premature death would affect the life product. So during prior committee hearings on Senate Bill 247, the suggestion was made to put a limit on the amount of coverage before genetic information can be used. There are no other medical tests for which a threshold like this exists. Therefore, the bill would create something we call genetic exceptionalism. The director of the genomic medicine program at the University of Vermont observed in a 2016 Burlington Free Press interview that, quote, taking a patient's genetic information is no different than taking her blood pressure, heart rate, weight, and height. We wholeheartedly agree with that characterization and ask that genetic information be treated in the same way as those measurements, since they are all relevant to longevity. As genetic testing becomes more routine, that will make adverse selection even more likely to drive up costs, undermine solvency, and disrupt the insurance market. I would like to circle back to the specific concern that was expressed by UVM as the reason the bill should be passed. while a subset of consumers may indicate a fear or perceived fear of insurance discrimination as the reason for not being tested, there are many other reasons. Fear is a strange thing that's difficult to counteract. So there is limited assurance that passage will result in more people agreeing to testing. On the other hand, damage to the insurance market is much more likely to be the result. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I welcome any remaining questions you might have.
Okay, committee, do we have any questions? None. Senator Sirotkin.
I'm muted. Can you hear me? Okay.
Just slightly. You might get closer to your mic.
You mentioned something, one option would be guaranteed issuance. How would that work?
That is a different type of product. There are different companies that offer different types of products. And so that's a type of product that often you'll hear advertised on television or on radio, where you apply. It typically is a smaller amount of insurance, but the way that works is you apply for it, everyone is charged the same amount. There's no underwriting. And so that is one option for people who don't want to be underwritten and don't want information, not just this information, but any information to be considered. It's one way that they can gain some coverage.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're all familiar with those ads. Senator Bray and then Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ms. Van Domelen. The question I have is about how clearly identifiable is genetic information. You know, like, is there a bright line? It seems like medical science has been collecting genetic information in a variety of ways for a long period of time. The science is evolving quickly. So I'm just trying to understand why at this point, what threshold we've crossed that makes this practice sort of clearly identifiable and more clearly of concern to the industry.
What I would say is the problem being there isn't necessarily that bright line. For instance, there are inherited conditions that put people at risk for blood clots. There are tests that look for those proteins that put them at higher risk, but they can be affected by other things, other medications they're taking, and it can affect the accuracy of those tests. Now that we understand the actual genetics behind those inherited blood clotting disorders, we are much more likely to rely on the genetic testing of it. So in some ways, the fact that there is a shift in certain cases to do the genetic testing for diagnosis of conditions, by telling us we may not be able to use that information, you're actually taking away the ability to underwrite things that we used to rely on non-genetic tests to underwrite.
And okay, and I think the second question I have is related to genetics. Doesn't necessarily translate directly into your health. I mean, there's a variability in terms of how genes are expressed, right? So to what degree does having a positive test for finding a particular genomic sequence predict the likelihood of that disease manifesting? And might someone even, improve the odds of continued good health by having received that genetic information and then opting to take medicine that might prevent the disease from manifesting?
Absolutely. The way I would describe or give an example of the situation you're describing is that, first of all, there is no one thing that we use to underwrite. Underwriting is a very holistic process. And so just one test should not be the overall determination of how we underwrite and decide on pricing for a policy. So we would definitely look at the larger health efforts that a person is undergoing to try to counteract any risk. The one caveat to that is, unfortunately, we were hoping that there will be many more ways of treating these conditions, but still the majority of the time, I would say, there aren't necessarily interventions that can make a difference in the ultimate outcome. So yes, we look at it globally. If there are ways to intervene, we absolutely take that into account, because we are looking for every possible way we can offer some level of coverage to people. We have seen that change over time. For example, it's an exciting time now where we're starting to see that even HIV, it may be insurable in certain circumstances. That was not true when I started in this industry, but thanks to treatments, we are moving in that direction and grateful that we will hopefully get to where many more people will be able to be offered coverage.
And if I may, Madam Chair, just one last question, and that is a quick one. Since we're on some sort of genetic testing continuum, it's not entirely hypothetical that there are people getting tests who are also out there purchasing insurance. Has the industry documented adverse selection? Have you seen rate impacts?
What I would say, certainly, at this point, I haven't necessarily seen it affect rates. But I am definitely seeing more testing. I think clinicians would tell you that's more testing. When I started in the industry, I might see a genetic test come through in medical records several times a month. At this point, we may see it come through multiple times a day. And these are, because they are complex things, these are important cases to come to the medical staff to make sure that they are considered appropriately, because each situation is unique. So we're seeing it much more often. We are definitely seeing adverse selection where people are not forthright in telling us that they know these risks. And so that's where it becomes concerning for us if we cannot take them into account if we find them in the medical record.
Okay. Thank you for your testimony.
Okay.
Thank you.
Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this might be a question also for our legislative counsel when we get to him, but you mentioned, I think you called it insurance tourism.
Yeah.
And do you mean by that people sort of coming to Vermont and buying an insurance policy, or leaving Vermont and buying an insurance policy somewhere else? Okay.
Correct.
I thought I remember us being told that this would only be excuse me, I'm sorry, my brain. This bill would only impact Vermonters getting insurance in Vermont. And so that's where I'm a little confused by that concept.
Absolutely glad to clarify. And in fact, I think the insurance department did provide additional information and clarification that indeed it is true that insurance tourism can exist. There is no way to stop someone coming to it. They just have to be there for signing and application purposes. They do not necessarily need to be documented residents of a state to purchase in a state. So there is concern, especially in a state that is smaller. And while it's very exciting that you have University of Vermont creating a Center for Excellence in Genetics that will draw many people to there, it may also mean they are drawing many people there who are motivated to purchase insurance there if Vermont provides them with these protections for people who aren't from Vermont.
Okay. All right. I think that is not what we heard before, so we'll just need to get clarification, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I do believe there's a letter that was provided, so that should be available to you.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just right now, an insurance company cannot require a genetic test. But if the genetic test is in the medical record, they can use it. Is that right, Emily?
Correct. The
Okay.
insurance company cannot require you to undergo a genetic test for underwriting or procurement of insurance, but if it's in your medical record, they can use it currently.
So if I tell my GP and give them a copy of the record, then it's in my record. This bill would say you can't use it anyhow or anyway. And it also limits family history, right? Unless the family history is in my medical record. Okay, and that's what would make us one of the most restrictive in the country. I believe there's one other state, and why am I thinking of Rhode Island, that has done this? So I
I'm
think,
not aware of any state that restricts us regarding family history.
okay. Okay. Senator Pearson.
Thank you. Florida has something akin to what we're considering here.
Mhm.
And millions of people visit Florida. While we pride ourselves as being a tourist destination, it's nothing like the volume of Florida. So could you talk about the impact of this concern you're seeing coming through Florida?
Certainly. First of all, I'll differentiate Florida as not restricting family history. They also allow for genetic information and genetic testing to be used if it is for purposes and confirmatory diagnosis of a condition. So that's a slight variation in Florida. Now, as far as adverse selection, I think we are starting to see some of that happen there. It is very early on, so that we do not want to wait until we're seeing adverse selection result in higher mortality than has been priced for, because if we wait for that to happen, it's probably too late to pull back. We are watching carefully for insurance tourism. We have started to see it happen, but we also need to understand this has only been in place for just about a year there. So it's very early on. And so it's probably too soon to know the level of effect. But as you said, a lot more people travel there, but a lot more people also live in Florida. So those risks are being transferred to a larger population.
So, Senator Bray.
Just one quick question on if you noticed increased mortality and then increased cost, it's too late. I always thought that that underwriting and reserve requirements built in significant safety margin. Could you not adjust rates or be more stringent on underwriting and, sort of ride out a number of a claims experience that starts to trend the wrong way?
But one of the problems is if it trends the wrong way, we can't raise the rates of the people who already have a policy with us. And so we would only be able to raise the rates of people who subsequently seek coverage from us. And that's a much smaller population. And it would be difficult to try to recoup those increased losses at the point that we're seeing the increased mortality. Let me also say that, yes, trying to price for that ahead of time, we have decades, hundreds of years of actuarial science and understanding that when we have the information, how we should price things. The difficulty with this, if we are not allowed to see what genetic information is out there, we don't know how much adverse selection is coming at us necessarily. And so it makes it much more difficult and much more speculative for us to understand what current pricing should be based upon increased genetic testing availability to people and increased potential for adverse selection. So we would much rather underwrite appropriately with all of the information so that we can rely upon the actuarial pricing as being accurate.
Okay. So if adverse selection is taking place with those of us who have our policy, and you have to raise rates, it will be on the next generation. And who is blaming the baby boomers for everything from lack of housing to high college costs? And this would probably be another one to add to the list, because we wouldn't pay the cost necessarily. Our rates are locked in the day we buy the policy.
Correct. As I mentioned, though, the one exception to that is long-term care. Individual
Yes.
your prices, the premiums are locked in. But if there is significant adverse claims experience, the entire existing block of business can have the premiums increased. And that's something we absolutely
Yes.
want to avoid.
And that has happened, given my email. Okay, committee, any other questions? Senator Bray.
One more, to what degree does the industry, I mean, probably the most protective posture you could take would be to stop underwriting, stop selling in the state of Vermont. I'm just wondering to what degree that's being contemplated by any of your members.
Yeah, that what I would say is we are very, very sensitive to antitrust issues within our organization. And so while we can speak of risks, we really do not discuss things at that level. I will say that there are things that come short, opportunities that all companies, we don't want to stop selling. We don't want to stop offering coverage and protection to families. But there may be other things that we do saying we can't take on more than a certain amount of risk for any one applicant. So one possibility is we stop selling above a certain amount in the state to see how that goes and see how much adverse selection we are able to detect. And if that's going to be enough to offer protection and maintain solvency. So there are multiple levers to pull. Our goal would be not to suddenly stop sales, but for something like long-term care, that could be the outcome just because that is a very unique circumstance.
Okay. Senator Brock.
I'm just wondering if you are aware of situations in the past where states have imposed requirements that have resulted in significant increases in premiums or in the company's decisions to no longer do certain kinds of businesses in states. Are you aware of situations like that in the past?
I think that, and again, every company is different in their decision making. I think I am aware of certain circumstances that there are states that, because of not necessarily one law, but a combination of laws, that companies will charge a higher premium in general in those states than other states. So yes, that circumstance does exist. The other thing, as far as shutting down, I would say we don't want to shut down, and we do everything possible to prevent that. But there was a recent circumstance out in Washington state where, because of a law passed, almost the entire industry had to stop selling long-term care coverage for a period of time. Luckily, we have gotten past that, where we have been able to re-enter the market, but that was a very concerning time for all of us.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Other questions? Okay. Senator Sirotkin.
Yeah, I don't mean to go backwards here. Maybe it's a very basic question, but could you distinguish what is being suggested here from the federal mandate on pre-existing conditions coverage?
That's health insurance.
I'm sorry, was that a question to me or?
Yes.
Well, the federal law, if I may, I believe you're referring to GINA, the Genetics Information Non-Discrimination Act.
No, I was talking about the Obamacare requirement on covering pre-existing conditions.
Oh, well, here, let me approach it this way then. One of the ways that ends up being balanced is that there is a requirement for purchase. And when we're talking life, disability, and long-term care, this is all voluntarily purchased. And if you do not have large enough numbers of people who are forced to purchase, something like Obamacare is really not possible. I heard someone mention the UK, and one of the caveats of the UK and why they've been able to do what they've done with life insurance is is used differently there. There is a connection between being able to have a mortgage and being required to have insurance, life insurance, to pay off that mortgage. So there is almost a small mandate there. The other reason that there was motivation to change the law there is they did not want people prevented from owning a home based upon underlying genetic testing and conditions. So that what every country, every state is very unique in their motivations, in the products, in the circumstances. And so what I would say is without the mandate, something like Obamacare and the protections related to pre-existings do not work in a voluntary market.
And one last question. You may have answered this earlier, or someone may have. Do you have any predictions whatsoever if this bill were to pass, what you might expect as a percentage increase in rates?
You know, that would vary quite a bit between life, disability, and long-term care. As I've mentioned, long-term care is in a very different circumstance. How much rates would have to increase really depends on the level of anti-selection we're seeing. We don't want to be forced to increase rates, and we would hold off to make sure, I think, seeing what circumstances happened after a bill might be passed, but every company is going to be different in their level of concern and risk tolerance for anti-selection, whether they feel they need to act sooner than later.
Okay, so long-term care, you can raise the rates on the market as a whole.
Correct.
So if I know that early onset Alzheimer's does have a genetic connection. There can be some familial. So if you know that, you can make decisions about that person or that person's risk, because early onset Alzheimer's can also be very expensive, especially if they're young, male, and they can be prone to violence. And it's very difficult to find a facility that will take them at some point. So that's long-term care. If you knew that in advance. But for everybody else, you can't raise for life and disability. Once I have a policy and I can go out the next day and have a genetic test. Once I have a policy, you can't raise any of our rates individually or as a group. And so by the time you know you're getting adverse selection, your only option is to raise the price for the next group coming through, either our younger siblings or our children. So it will get passed down. It won't come back to us. It will just be future rates will be higher. The danger being that it could price out of the market.
Certainly, and
Is that what I'm hearing?
That's absolutely correct. And one thing we're very sensitive to in the industry is just the high number of people who don't have this kind of coverage. And our goals have been to try to expand financial security to more people. And so the last thing we want to do is have things that would increase premiums and take that away from more families.
Okay. Okay, up Senator Pearson.
Thank you. I guess I'm a little puzzled why the threat of rate increase is in this discussion since you don't, I mean, we're basically sort of freezing in time. I mean, you don't have this information except for in a small number of people who have these in their medical records ahead of getting insurance. So help me understand. I appreciate that you'd like to have all the data you could possibly have, but you've been operating kind of in the universe we're discussing here for decades. So
Yeah.
why is it automatically a rate increase dynamic?
It's not.
Great question. Let me dive a little bit deeper into what adverse selection means to us. So for someone who there's a study that's been done, for example, in long-term care, where they took people who came to a research facility and underwent genetic testing, and then assessed them and surveyed them on how that might change their interest in buying long-term care insurance. And there was a significant increase in people who, if they tested positive or versus negative, whether they had interest in purchasing insurance to begin with. So many more people who know that they have concern for this would be likely to buy insurance who might not have otherwise before. And there is motivation to max out how much coverage that they will find a way to afford more coverage if they have this known concern. So that can really upset what has been the normal balance in pricing.
Thank you.
So it's not your knowing, it's the purchaser knowing and you're not knowing.
Correct.
It's all right. And this bill, I believe, also says you can't use family history. It doesn't. Okay. It says you can't use a genetic test of family members unless it's in your medical record. Okay. So I think if we have any more questions, all right, Senator Bray.
Whoops, thank you. I'm just wondering how often in underwriting, the underwriters end up, it's not supposed to be a clever question. It's just dawning on me as we talk about it. Underwriters are full-time professionals looking at whatever, hundreds or thousands of records over time.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed like you might actually know more about the applicants than the applicants know about themselves in terms of underwriting. I mean, you could end up declining a policy or reducing the face amount or any number of things, excluding a condition because you see a likelihood that the patient or applicant themselves may not have perceived yet. So I'm just wondering if the playing field's not entirely, adverse selection could work from both sides of the table, I suppose.
The way I would answer that is primarily where we get our information in underwriting is from the applicant's own medical record. And so these are things I would sincerely hope that their clinical provider has discussed with them and is managing with them. And so to the extent that we can prevent it, there should be a level playing field there. There should be a consistent awareness, unless there's something that the clinician unfortunately hasn't fully explained to that person.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, then we're going to go back to Emily and Damien. I think Damien's here. And okay, Emily, Next, you have a presentation for us?
I don't have a presentation. I had sent an email, I believe it was last week, clarifying my previous testimony, and then just also, and I didn't propose language for an amendment, but a concern that we noticed in the current language, which either, we'd appreciate some clarification on, or propose amending the current bill to reflect our current understanding of the intent of the bill. So I was going to walk through those 2 points.
Okay, yes, that would be helpful.
Okay. So first all, just to go back to Senator Hardy's comment. So after my testimony last time, I did go back and speak with other members of the department. I think I had my health insurance hat on. There is no residency requirement for the purchase of life insurance. There is a requirement that the individual be present in the state, but that could be someone who might be vacationing in Vermont or have, like I think Senator Cummings, you mentioned last time, have a house in Vermont, a second house, and come here and purchase their life insurance without being a resident of the state. This situation could also exist. I think this situation was brought up last time, where if someone had formed a trust in the state, the actual insured individual, so the individual whose life was being insured under the policy, would not have to be in the state as long as the trust was domiciled in Vermont. So the trust could purchase a life insurance policy, but the actual insured individual could be in another state, such as California. So the individual who was insured would not have to be present in the state for their life to be insured under a policy. So that was my first clarification. And then my second point I wanted to talk about today was the use of family medical history. The Department of Financial Regulation looked at the current draft of the bill, and the way we would interpret the current language would be a broad prohibition on the use of family medical history. And we're garnering that understanding from the change in definition of genetic information, which is in section 1. And I believe it's subsection 6B, which says includes in the definition of genetic information, the manifestation of a disease or disorder in a family member of the individual. So if the department were to apply this prohibition on using genetic information, we would read this as also prohibiting the use of any family medical information that was in an individual's medical record. So for instance, if you had told your doctor that your mother had ovarian cancer, we would read this language as prohibiting an insurer from using that information to underwrite a life insurance, or sorry, a long-term care or disability income policy, for instance. I believe the current version of the bill does have a carve out for life insurers to use the family medical history, but that same carve out is not included for other policies, as I mentioned, for long-term care or a disability income policy. It's our understanding, after looking at policies which we have on file and have approved, that is a common request of insurers, or something that insurers currently use when they're underwriting policies in Vermont. So if that was the intent of the bill, then I suggest we keep it in. But I believe the intent was just to limit it to genetic information, and not have that definition of genetic information include the family medical history. So I think we were just looking for clarification on that and a potential amendment if necessary.
Okay. Questions for Emily? Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks, Emily, for that clarification. That clears up my confusion. On the second issue about the family history.
Yeah.
In looking at, and maybe this is a question for Damien, who I see on the screen, because in looking at his side-by-side or summary of the bill, it says that it makes the definition consistent with the Federal Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Does GINA also prohibit the use of family history, or do you know? or I don't know who I'm asking, whoever knows the answer.
So the important thing to note about GINA is it applies to health insurance
Right.
and employment. It doesn't apply to the lines of insurance we've been discussing, like life, disability, or long-term care.
Okay. So in the definition though, knowing that, does the definition of GINA prohibit the use of family history, essentially that paragraph B, what is it? B, is that included in the definition for GINA?
Yes, I'm pulling up the definition right now, and some of the other witnesses here may know right off the top of their head.
I don't know the exact language, but I would share that depending upon the interpretation, there is an interpretation of GINA at the federal level that does prohibit much of, if not all of, the use of family history.
Okay, for the provision of health insurance only though.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And
Sorry, I would just say that when that bill was being discussed at the federal level, it was not a lack of understanding related to, or it was not an oversight, I would say, as far as including life, disability, and long-term care in that. It was a very deliberate. In fact, there was an outright exclusion for its application to life and disability insurance because there was the recognition of concern about anti-selection and how it could affect the market.
Okay, yeah, so GINA is just health insurance, which is totally different fish. I mean, you just, those premiums aren't locked in on day one. They aren't prohibited from changing. It just says they can't deny you or health insurance because you have a family history that might indicate that you might come down with this disease. Whereas the other, well, no, long-term care is still out there, but the other ones, your rate is locked in the day you sign, and it is based on the likelihood, that you are going to live so long or need, and therefore you need, that can be very adversely affected by if you have a pre-existing condition that the insurer doesn't know about. The insurer thinks you're going to live another 60 years and you're only going to live another 6. That greatly increases that changes the field. So, okay. Ruth.
Yeah, I had a couple more questions. Emily, did you have something to add? Because you started to say something and got interrupted.
Yeah, I just was going to offer much to what Senator Cummings just said. Currently in major medical health insurance in the state, insurers are not allowed to underwrite at all. So they're not allowed to currently use your genetic information, your family medical history, your personal history. It's community rated. So everyone pays the same rate regardless of any pre-existing conditions. So I just wanted to offer that current, to reflect what current law also says.
For health insurance.
For health, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, very specific to major medical health insurance.
Okay, I have another question. Just sort of looking at that the link that I think your office sent, Emily, about the English, British, UK,
yep.
whatever they're called, that their policy, it says something about not ask or take into account the results of any predictive genetic testing obtained through scientific research. And I'm wondering if there is a distinction, that could be made there based on my understanding is some of the reasons why UVM wants this is for scientific research, and is there a way to make a distinction or not there?
I believe there is, but I would probably defer to my colleagues sorry, Jill. Jill's not my colleague anymore, but ACLI.
We have that problem too.
or UVM to answer those issues specifically around how genetic information is separated, as far as if there is kind of a
Okay.
different bucket for research versus your medical record. But I believe there is, but I would defer to others on specifics around that.
Okay.
Okay. I guess I would ask the chair if she wants to hear from them now or later. I just,
Um,
that would be helpful
Yeah,
to know.
we'll hear, Jill, can you?
I would defer to Dr. Deb as to how it's exactly, if there was a differentiation in how underwriting is done, but I will say that and I'm sorry I didn't give more notice, but the ACLI would be in favor of doing exactly that, sort of having a carve out for research purposes, given that UVM is a large research hospital. That's the route that Louisiana took in its law that was just passed last year, and we would be in favor of that as a compromise.
All right, carve out for research. Jason Williams is here in case we had a question. And from UVMC, I would just ask, I didn't get the impression that UVM wanted genetic information primarily for research. Is that the primary purpose of gathering genetic information?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason Williams, for the record, from the University of Vermont Health Network. No, we are not. This is not a request for legislation and public policy driven by our research practice. This is about whether or not in the care of Vermonters and of patients, we are able to access and integrate genetic information into the medical record, not just for, I think a lot of us think in our heads ourselves, not just for adults who are making these decisions for themselves, but also for children and people who are not yet born, who will have the results of genetic information included in their medical record for the rest of their lives, and be able to use that without fear of discrimination. So this is about integration into the practice of medicine and into the healthcare of individuals, not just about research.
Okay. All right. Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple questions for Emily. Would there be anything illegal or would you see problems if we had some kind of waiting period in terms of this residency question, or for certain kinds of insurance, a 6-month residency or some proof of establishing? I mean, to me, it's not a big issue, but I also seems like it wouldn't be that hard for us to address. And I'm curious if there are concerns that you might have.
So if you're talking about a waiting period where you purchase the policy and are paying premium, but then have to wait to receive the benefits, are you speaking
No, I
to-
mean, before you, I guess, would be able to buy it if you were, I mean, in other words, to try to, I'm still not sure. I believe it's going to be a problem at scale, but I don't think we're considering this policy in order to lure people here to buy policies under our updated rules. So wondering if there are ways we might address that.
So I think we could, but I would just caution that with these longer tail products like life insurance, long-term care, where you have the product over several years and they're meant to be portable. So you're meant to be able to buy a life insurance policy and then move to another state. So I would just say it would be a departure, I think, from, as far as I know, it would be a one-of-a-kind requirement in the country if we had a residency, a short-term residency requirement to purchase life insurance or long-term care. Yeah, so, but I guess off the top of my head, I don't see any legal issue with it. But again, I'd have to probably take that back and ask others in the department.
Okay, well, I was just curious. In a related question, that there's been sort of a discussion here about our policies and what it would do to our prices and the risk pool and DFR looks at solvency, I know, before you can insure and all of that, but these are not Vermont companies. These are national, if not more broad, international companies, and so I'm curious, when DFR is looking at these products and the companies that are offering them, are you getting a look at national figures and I mean, I guess my hunch would be that it is sort of the risk is shared in a broader pool than just the policies shared in Vermont. I wonder, maybe I'm wrong, and wonder, Emily, if you could comment, and specifically if DFR looks at figures unrelated to the Vermont population when you're examining these companies and these policies.
Yeah, so you're correct. Most of the companies are non-domestic life insurance companies, but we do have a life insurer domiciled in Vermont, National Life. But I would also just say that we don't regulate rates for life insurance. So we don't pre-approve rates for life insurance that are sold in Vermont. So again, that would be those rates charged would be the decision of the life insurers who are selling within the state. And just going back to the earlier testimony, I believe if an insurer found that there was a higher risk of insuring Vermont individuals, the rates for Vermonters would be higher. But to go back to your question as well, we don't look at national solvency. The solvency of insurers is a state by state regulation. So I'm not sure if I answered your question clearly, but
yeah. Well, we always do well on national health surveys. We're sometimes ranked the healthiest state. So maybe this downgrade would balance us out. We'd have average prices. All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? Not, well, it's at 3 o'clock, which is when we are slated to end. But I want to put this one up for markup. So we will schedule it. We've got some open time next week. Hopefully that we'll get to the big bills. But we will put this one on for markup at next week. If anyone needs any more information, let me or Faith know, and we will we'll get that up. We have a break if you'd like
Madam Chair,
to go through the bill now and give up break, but
I don't want to give up break, but Emily had referenced the proposal of truing up some of the language and some of the way we've been discussing it. And I didn't know if we have that or if we could ask for that.
yes, she's, I believe, sent that to us last week.
Okay.
And I think the big,
Damien has that.
yeah, the health and welfare that put this bill out last year at final hour, maybe, we added that section on unless it's part of the family history that's part of your medical record could be used, but that has not been extended to the other two categories of insurance, or to all insurance. So I think if we did that, it might allay some of the concerns. But I believe that's it. I saw people shaking their heads. So we'll go through this. We'll get it booked whenever we can get Damien next week. We've reached that crunch time for getting people. I'd like to get this one marked up, okay? All right, we're back at 3:15. So take a quick break and I will see you all and thank you. She's gone. I was going to say thank you to Dr. Van de Molen, and Emily and Damien, and we'll see you all again.